But what I find fun, I certainly do in my novels, the steampunk ones as well as just the adult ones I read with my husband, is I love to pull actual history and actual mythology and things and kind of weave it into the fantasy world. I think it's a lot of fun, and I think that would be great. Yeah, the Wright brothers would be great to write a short story.
Yeah.
An idea. Yeah, so that could be a lot of fun. What I like to do is I take certain people or myths or technology that actually existed at the time, but weren't very well known, and just kind of shine a spotlight on them. So like my main character of Avalon Revisited is Arthur Tudor, who was the older brother of King Henry VIII, if you know your English history. But he didn't get a whole lot of play in history because he died very young, and then Henry came heir to the throne and so forth. So he, in my world, becomes a vampire instead of just dying. He was turned, and kind of the whole fantasy thing and how he was turned and all that kind of fits in with history. You know, it's like all the historical things are accurate except that he just rose again and no one really knew. And this is like 350 years later in Victorian London. And he's kind of a cheeky bastard now all these years later, but yeah. So I'm taking someone really people don't really know about Arthur and giving him like a little bit more time in the spotlight. And some of the technology I do the same in actually both the books. You know, things that actually existed then, but people didn't really know about, or it didn't take off, or it wasn't further developed, or whatever.
And history's full of technologies that had some sort of precursor back in the midst of time.
It's a lot of fun to look through the old patents.
Oh yeah.
And see some of the bizarre things they came up with. I boldly swiped a couple of those for my story.
Very sweet.
Yeah. Yes.
I was just pointing out one of the inventions back then. Babbage, had created a computer, but it never worked. It was called the analytical machine.
He invented the idea and was able to make part of it.
And Ada Lovelace came up with the punch card system.
Yes.
Yeah.
She did it to try to win horse races.
Yeah.
Well, sort of.
Yeah, well, it was.
Well, no, it's considering the whole thing was because this is the reason why they quietly removed a lot of her background from the Ada programming language, when they found that she was actually running it as a confidence scam, which was kind of the interesting part of it, is that she actually had, a lot of it was legit, but a whole other side of it wasn't. And the parts that they were after, that they didn't want, were the parts that were legitimate, like her ability to actually write the programming language. That was just kind of an accident. But there's a whole lot of that. I mean, because I'm an antique tool collector and I deal in a lot of the antique technologies. And so when you get into the patents, they're fun.
Mm-hmm.
And I miss the days when we actually had models of a lot of them, because I've actually seen quite a few of them.
Cool.
Oh.
And
What are some of the more unusual ones that you've seen?
Some of the technologies were, I've looked at some of the automated train decouplings. Some of the interesting ones were things like how to actually connect belts together, to connect the leather belts together, so that you could actually, and the fun part is when you see the tools do it now, because nobody knows what they are. And so we're all scratching our heads going, okay, what is that? And so you have no clue, because a lot of times more than a third of the tools have no patents on them. Of the instruments out there have no patents on them. So you have, it's almost as bad as doing the paleontologist on an animal now, because a lot of the technology is just false.
So there's no written reference.
There's no written reference, and worse yet, there's no cultural reference, which is worse. Because having a written reference is nice, but that tells you what it is. That's all fine and dandy. I, for one, do not want to have to guess how certain tools work, because they're sharpened steel. How do they work? You know, you
What am I really supposed to do with this thing?
What was it intended to do, and how do you actually use it? Because when you see things like making windows, it's a moving piece of metal that travels in a track. There's a interesting concept, and until somebody knows how to use it, you don't know what this thing is. And that would, for some of the stuff in steampunk, that may actually be an interesting aspect for people to take on, is the lost parts of her tech.
Well, did they actually work? Because I know people have drawn things that don't work.
Well, if you got a patent, it worked.
I would debate that argument.
Well, understand, it worked. It did something.
There's a vast problem currently being addressed by, or trying to be addressed by the government with patent office, based on the fact that when you submit a patent, you don't actually have to submit a working model.
That's the difference. So I'm talking about the period when you did. Before the 1950s and 1960s, even up in the 80s like it is, when they changed the patent rules.
Late 70s, early 80s, they had to change.
Yeah, and the worst part was, this is the crime against humanity, was the U.S. Patent Office was ordered to dump the patent models.
All the original history, backstock of patent models actually got hauled off to warehouses, sold, lots of them destroyed.
Yeah.
They just disappeared.
So,
There's short stories in there.
There's whole
Oh,
sets
yeah.
of technology that just don't exist anymore. They've been lost in the same.
yeah, and there's
What about in other countries? Did the same thing happen?
not as much. I mean, other countries still have some of it. And so one of the ways we find things is, now the big issue we had was, the other one was the 1940s. Because I'm about to hand off to someone else in the audience here in a minute, was, the other one was World War II, and a lot of the patents and stuff were destroyed because, okay, we need the metal.
Yeah.
So here's the source of it.
Yeah.
And because the whole world was desperate for any metals of any kind that they could use, and all the wooden parts of the model, well, they fuel the furnaces to melt the metal down.
Yeah.
I read about Nikola Tesla and all of his inventions that he had patented. Most of them were lost to time, or they weren't really, he wasn't able to patent them, and he had tons of ideas and inventions that he had made. So I feel like those inventions were lost to time as well. So
Tesla figured into at least one steam
Lots
locomotive.
of cases.
I'm sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Lots
that.
and lots of Tesla's doing.
he had a definitely idea.
Yeah.
I think there's something to be said for that.
Two questions. One, has anybody tried Edison? That man had so many cool little toys that could be used. The other one is the loom. You start off with the weaving loom. It was the loom, the belt that ran the shuttles, the heddles going up and down, the shuttles going back and forth, which inspired the guy to create the tape, the first computer tapes. And it may have, I believe they started computers, or at least the part of it, from weaving. Has anyone used weaving in steampunk?
No, I think Edison kind of fell out of favor because he was so well known, so famous, and whereas Tesla kind of could be the romantic, misunderstood genius. Edison was very good promoted.
There are long lists of books that actually document the rivalry that they had between the two of them.
Pretty nasty.
Yes, I read Nikola
It's
Tesla.
just about open warfare between the two of them.
Yeah, it ends with that electrocuting an elephant. You
Yeah.
know?
Well, Tesla did.
But I think that, I think also Edison, because he was better known as perhaps not as mysterious and charming a figure as, you don't know that much about Tesla. He tended to be very private, very paranoid in some ways. So you can do more speculation rather. Edison, of course, you could really turn him easily into the archetypal scheme villain because he had all these villages made. Everybody was going to live this Disney life, and
Go to,
he was quite interesting.
Florida sometime. I went there to his museum and his house. I like architecture and stuff, so we got to be in there. And there's banyan trees, there was plants, there was machines, there was little inventions. There was even a patent for Raggedy Ann of all things. It just had a lot of weird stuff that I've seen some of the artwork and stuff that the steampunk has had here. And it kind of, some of this stuff reminded me of it, so.
He may be waiting to be rediscovered by some writers.
Now, on that same line, is it Thomas Jefferson that did Monticello?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, Monticello has actually got all sorts of really, really crazy engineering tricks hidden into the architecture of it for hidden doorways, panels.
Yeah, I've been there to the Monticello, and they had.
An inventor, among
He
other
he
things.
made a device where when he wrote like a journal down, he created a separate device that would mimic whenever he wrote, it would write
Yeah, he
in
could
his
make-
same
he had
handwriting.
basically a
So he basically had a
where he
copy
could
machine.
Write, scribe multiple copies
Yeah,
at
it's
the
called
same time.
pantograph.
I wouldn't be surprised if there was something that could be used there for the start of the story.
Is that Jefferson and Franklin, are they considered steampunk too?
They would be actually.
They should be,
They
but they're.
could, yeah, they could be. I mean,
Franklin probably might even outdo Jefferson as an inventor.
It depends on how far
Yeah.
back you want to take it. Have there been some pretty old histories incorporated in steampunk? Am I mistaken in thinking that somebody did ancient Egypt as steampunk, or am I just totally
I don't, if
drawing a
they,
blank
yeah, if they
on
did,
that?
I don't know. I think up until this point, this is where, as of now, it's been pretty much contained in the Victorian, especially the second half of the Victorian era. Or, maybe around the Civil War, it's like even Sherry Priest's bone jinker, happens. It's an alternate history, but like when the Civil War was still went on a lot longer, but it was happening here. What was going on in the Civil War at the time in her steampunk world? But I think as steampunk is still, the name is, the name has just become like this buzzword. It's so popular. I think we're going to start seeing things that are branched out. And if someone did something in ancient Egypt, it likely had to do with time travel, which is a big theme.
I'm not sure if I'm misremembering,
Yeah.
and at this point, I very well could be.
Yeah. but-
I think my first steampunk book, I didn't even know it was steampunk. Before it was steampunk, was The Time Machine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Oh,
think.
yeah, it was like original steampunk.
Yeah, original. Yeah.
Why is it that, I kind of understand the steam part, but
punk
where does
part,
the
yeah.
punk come from?
Well, steampunk covers, because basically what it is Victorian science fiction. So we talk about the time machine, you talk about Wells's work, or
Jules Verne.
Verne, or even Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I would consider steampunk. Or I would consider Victorian science fiction fantasy. Okay.
And don't forget Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote science
Yeah.
fiction, among
No,
other things.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
all that would be like, would be today considered steampunk, but of course the term didn't exist then. It was just.
It didn't exist till the 80s
Yeah,
when someone
science,
coined the
yeah.
phrase.
Yeah, it was, yeah. That's what I said at the beginning, K.W. Jeter coined the phrase steampunk in the early 80s. And I think the steam part comes from, because that's what the technology is powered by, or clockwork. That's why it's diesel punk. The punk part comes into where it is, it's an edgy kind of fringe of society. A lot of the steampunk movement has been really brought by, has been funneled in by a lot of goths, a lot of people who are like on the fringes, who like maybe work like at Renaissance fairs or more of a gypsy feel. They've all funneled in on a really large scale into the steampunk movement. So because it was also coined in the early 80s, that was also during the really kind of punk phase where the punks were coming out of England. Like,
Cyberpunk.
yeah.
Cyberpunk existed before, so I I think
Yeah, and so I
took
think that's what it
the.
was,
Until,
it's
yeah, it
kind
did
of,
become
it's
famous
this,
until a lot of
they're
kids
taking
did.
that punk aspect and mixing it with
The
Victorian
punk is
science.
the attitude, okay.
Yes.
Then do you really call Jules Verne
No.
and H.G. Wells punk?
No, it would fall under steampunk now, because that's what we've learned that steampunk is.
They aren't as
but-
dystopian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My take on it would be that the punk can imply a a social misfit kind of person or antisocial misfit kind of person.
Or a rebel.
Well, yeah, I'm getting there. Kind of parallel to Cyberpunk,
Yeah.
which featured, some definitely, social misfit people. But if you expand it a little bit, some of us are social misfits, are inventors, explorers, and
Absolutely.
uppity women that don't want to stay inside a narrowly defined role. Then you've got all kind of historical people and all kinds of people with whom writers and readers can identify.
Yeah, well, but the whole idea of science fiction is you want to try something different.
Right.
So it's hard for me to differentiate at this point.
I think it's one of those genres that it's a spectrum. Where does science fiction end and fiction begin? Where does fantasy end and science fiction begin? You get a very broad liminal area where there's so much overlap, you can't cut it down the middle and say, and here you shelve them this way, and here you shelve them that way. Even librarians have that problem.
In fact, you can have stories that are simultaneously both. of
Absolutely,
one
yeah,
thing
you're
and
seeing a
another.
lot more mashups.
I have discovered that in the process of creating our game system, when you describe to somebody as having a game that actually has steampunk elements, it automatically conjures certain aspects and certain imagery that carries along with that. Some people receive that well and some people don't. Every once in a while you run across somebody that conceives of steampunk as a fashion statement.
Yeah, well,
Only a fashion statement.
and a lot of people, yeah.
And there's other people that think of, like you were talking about, the folks that subdivide it down into diesel punk, and et cetera, et cetera. I think those people are going to have a harder and harder time coping with the process as it becomes more and more kind of a publicly aware thing.
Yeah, and steampunk is definitely built around the aesthetic. I mean, the aesthetic is really
It's
what
very important.
it's what draws most people into steampunk.
But
is the aesthetic.
it goes beyond that.
Absolutely goes
Yeah,
beyond
it
that,
goes
but that's
beyond that.
generally
I
what.
mean,
the
you're writing
first-
stories on it, so there's more
Absolutely.
content than,
Well, and there's games on it, and
Exactly.
there's movies, and there's music, there's steampunk bands.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
So there's definitely is more than just the aesthetic, but when people are drawn to it,
Mhm.
the thing that they're usually first drawn to is the aesthetic.
it's the visual appeal.
Yeah.
It's just that, to me, it kind of makes me bristle a little bit when that's what they stop.
Oh, absolutely,
You
yeah,
know?
it's more than just throwing a pair of
Yes.
goggles on your hat, yeah.
Or if that's where they try to stop you.
Yeah, or
Yes.
that's what they try to start
Yes.
doing.
You were mentioning that Wells and Verne are not quite so dystopian as some of the recent steampunk, but it might depend on which novels of Wells you read. How about The Invisible Man or Island of Dr. Moreau?
Yeah.
That guy could go.
Yes, we had a comment over there.
Okay, the first time I was even introduced or even knew about steampunk is when I watched it was a Japanese animation. It was called Steam Boy. It was about them being able to create a steam ball with unlimited steam to power things. And they sort of had at the very end a lot of illusions of what was going to happen in the future. And I would try to look it up online, and I found that it said it was a perfect example of steampunk. And I was like, what's steampunk? And so I just learned more, and that's how I got into steampunk.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of anime will pick up steampunk aspects. There's also Sakura Wars and a few others as well, where they're going to take on, they're actually taking it on from an alternate timeline. So there is no gasoline, everything is coal and steam. So there's a lot of that in one of my favorite pieces is the Lost piece of anime where it's steam powered max. It is completely and utterly insane because they're having to hand power the things. And it's a great piece of animation, but it is now lost because it went with somebody's rights into the great bankruptcy pile.
I cheated, I used magic.
I'm leaning
Yeah,
over
why not?
Alexis's notes and I see Krakatoa written there, and I'm just absolutely fascinated by
Yeah.
Krakatoa.
Krakatoa. Well, one of my interests would be that events in natural history that occurred in whatever time frame you're calling steampunk. And there's a book titled Krakatoa by that marvelous Simon Winchester. And his point is that Krakatoa, like when Krakatoa blew up and the shockwave went around the Earth 6 times, that was the first great natural disaster, the news of which traveled by telegraphy. And so instead of a month later you hear a rumor, it was like a day later people around the world are hearing about that. And all of these British weather stations and atmospheric outposts, you know, are registering this shock wave. That was, I think, late 1800s. And so the bit about telegraphy, that technology let that disaster be the one that suddenly made the great big wide world a lot smaller and rounder.
Yeah, and of course, other things that affect history, there was a bigger explosion, a volcanic explosion in Indonesia, much earlier that century, which created the year without a summer.
But that was one where, you know, word of it got around, you know.
By the fact that you didn't have a summer.
Yeah.
The weather changed.
And there's other wonderful natural disasters that could be brought on stage, like, you know, the San Francisco fire of 1905, a catastrophe, you know, smack dab in the city with all this stuff. The Galveston hurricane of 1900 could either be brought on stage or deflected from stage by some sort of technology.
Actually, that was the actually first one where they actually, Edison and his people were able to come and make newsreels of the aftermath.
Really? That was
Recorded
the
on
first?
moving motion pictures.
And also the first ones they were actually able to detect before it happened, just nobody would listen.
I find it interesting, actually, that some of the best recorded history collected in one place of the Galveston disaster is actually in the Galveston Railroad Museum. So,
Well, the railroad, you know, the
Yeah,
railroads
the
at the time
Railroad
were
Museum
such
is a
a
good place to
supreme
go to
technology.
look up what the trains were like at that time.
Yeah.
Oh,
It might be a good place for researching steampunk in this area.
been there, done that, researched it, cool stuff, just totally cool stuff. And yeah, to put anything in America, I can tell you because I've sort of, you know, done a pretty good research suite. To put anything in America in the late 1800s, you're talking about trains, steam locomotives, and railway china in the dining car. So there's, speaking of, you know, veering back to aesthetics, and the trains. This is a wonderful coolness that we've forgotten about. In, like when the Transcontinental Railway in 1864, when they joined the East and West, those two locomotives were resplendent because locomotives were always brightly painted, immaculately gilded, polished, and, you know, just really aesthetic masterworks. And we think, you know, oh gee, all trains or engines are black. No.
they're boring silver tubes now.
Now they are.
Yes.
100 years ago, it was different.
Boring still with silver tubes with stripes.
150 years ago, yeah. But these days, you know, look at airliners. And the docent at the Golden Spike National Historic Site explained this in the course of an engine house tour. She said, okay, these days, your passenger airlines, think Southwest, bright colors, flying Easter eggs. That was like the Jupiter, the Transcontinental Railway. The other locomotive was a commercial, you know, an industrial locomotive, more like some of our airliners that instead of carrying passengers, you know, they're maybe the corporate liveries of, you know, business jets and stuff, so they're more refined, less loud and brightly colored. But they are aesthetic things, and that's how how locomotives work.
And the other one is that since you were doing black and white films, that's where a lot of our view of the black and all trains being all black
Sure.
and monochromatic is
And-
because that's how you had to film them.
And all
so-
people wearing like brown clothes. No, coal oil dyes were invented, and some of those crowds probably had to be so
Yeah.
colorful it hurt the eye.
Right.
In
but-
fact, that affected things like Navajo weaving. They started getting the commercial dyes from the East, and I think they thought, hey, this is great stuff. You have all these bright colors we can play with now.
You don't have to grind up rocks.
Yeah.
Don't have to try and find the
Have
rare.
to do dyes anymore.
I don't have to find the rare stone that's going to give me a blue color. Because usually that amount of getting something heated up hot enough to actually get the alloy to come out. But yeah, so, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's triggered by how we perceive things now and what
Yeah.
happened with as things became more available.
That provided an interesting view, the change in technology, the conflicting
Mhm.
technology.
Yeah, how you recorded it versus how it really appears.
There's a set of photographs that have recently come out, I can't remember the history behind them. A set of photographs that have been developed that were from the 1920s, Dust Bowl era, that was done on an experimental type of film at the time that actually yielded color photographs. So they actually have color pictures from the 1920s.
Well, you had color movies from the teens.
Yeah, that gives this odd contrast of comparing it to so many other types of photographs from the time period, where you think, you get this mental image of people wearing all these boring, dowdy outfits. And there's actually lots of vibrant color, and lots of, things going on. that you don't see.
And possibly what we would consider, if we were there, violently clashing colors.
Yeah.
But that, again,
That's their,
the aesthetic
our
sensibilities
taste versus
change.
Yeah.
theirs. Which one of you was going to set one of their stories in Africa at the time of the Great White Hunters? Okay. You can probably also, if you feel like it, touch on or mention the names of some of the great explorers like Richard Burton or Stanley or Livingston.
Actually, they're in South Africa, so I'm going straight off of in doing my research, what I did was go into H. Rider Haggard. And was surprised to find out how readable these classic writers are.
Haggard was, when I started reading his book version of King Solomon's Mines, I could hardly put it down.
Yeah, and when you see these people who went, they really were the cream of the crop, and you compare them, I'm afraid, to some of our modern writers. Now that press is easy to come by, you can really see them working their craft. He was particularly good on reference material because he did not have the colonial viewpoint of the little brown man. But even that class bias can be interesting. There was several steampunks that had actually dealt with that class bias.
Yeah.
But he does a wonderful job, wonderful research. Class bias reminded me in steampunk, of course, of Phil Folio's comic, Girl Genius.
Yeah.
Just totally wild and crazy and
multi-people award-winning.
Yeah.
Yeah, Girl Genius did a lot to forward the steampunk movement, as did anime, which you were talking about before. I think anime, it kind of started as like this little subset of anime, I guess, that just kind of grew and just kind of, that's one of the reasons one of the reasons that it is so popular is because of anime. Well, because anime is so popular, and it was,
I think just the idea has charm. Back to the genteel ways and more mannered people.
That's a lot of it, and Gail Carriger will speak on that, kind of with just how polite everybody is, and with the manners, and everything is so proper. As well as when you look at the technology, it's not just useful, it's beautiful. When you look at our technology today, and it's not really much of anything, it's a brick.
It's got a black box.
Yeah, it's like a little black box, but technology then was, they were masterpieces, every one of them. Like you were talking about all the polished brass and the wood.
And the ivory,
and all that, and it was, and so you could look at that, and the quality was so much better. They lasted, there are still pocket watches that work.
Well, I was trained in Victorian woodworking. The rule was and is, it must last 100 years. You are insulting yourself, your customer, and your family if it ever has to be redone, repaired, or it's not done right. If you can't do it right, don't do it. And you gave 7 years of your life to gain that skill.
So I think that's part of the steampunk movement, that you're bringing back a bit more of that era of politeness and of manners and of quality and beauty and all these things, but, you're leaving behind the,
I want it, the issue
the
is
parts
you're giving up the, I want it now.
Yeah, well, you're
And I'll
giving
throw
that,
it
but
away
you're also.
tomorrow.
Yeah, the worst one is, and the big one is, yeah, I want it today, and I don't care if it lasts me a week. It's the whole early adopter concept comes into play, which changes the whole thing.
A lot of times the steampunks will say that, it's like rewriting history and doing it right, so we're taking like all the really beautiful things, but we're leaving behind a lot of the racism and the.
Yeah, we're not covering the,
Yeah,
a lot of the
or
darker
if we
aspects.
speak to it, you could speak to it, you could write about it as it was, but by then showing, shining a light on this is not okay.
Well, I think in leaving behind the racism, I'm not so sure, because I don't know that I'm aware of many steampunks where the hero is not Caucasian, or heroine is not Caucasian.
Yeah.
Now, my secondary hero is actually an African, but.
And that's really, it's an interesting point, because I talk a lot with Jamie Go and Eileen the Peacemaker, who are very, very active in the steampunk community and in multiculturalism in steampunk. And they talk about, especially Asian steampunk, and they talk a lot about racism and, this kind of exclusion among others. And it's interesting because, as a Caucasian middle-class author, I generally write about Caucasian middle-class people. That's kind of just where I'm coming from. And I've even thought about writing, I was thinking about writing a book where I had kind of an Asian superhero type woman as the protagonist, and I was advised against it. And so that kind of comes into it. It's like, yeah, people will talk about, it's like, okay, well, they're all Caucasian, they're all white, they're all middle class, they're all whatever, but that's where I'm coming from. I have no idea what it's like to be an Asian woman now, especially not what it was like to be then. And what you have, what I find is that, in trying to put yourself in there, you just can't even begin to imagine the level of racism coming from a very white middle class point of view. And I start talking about, I talk with Jamie and with Eileen about that, because I want to be able to kind of promote and further multiculturalism in steampunk as in all literature, but then you run the risk of offense and being and falling into the trap that you're trying to avoid by doing that, just because you don't.
Well, I have a question. How well does it come across, say, for example, most people in Steambook are looking at it from the upper class side, not the servant class.
Right.
Because everybody always thinks of Victorians as either having the person who's the housekeeper who's running and the various other persons who are running the house. So the heroine's always the person who has the housekeeper, the governess, and the whole bit. How often has it actually tried to deal with the story from the perspective of being the servant class?
Yeah, that would be a great perspective, because I know that's what I even write about. I even said it was middle class, but it's really not. It's like it's elite,
Yeah, it's the elite class, because there is no middle class, it's the servant class.
Yeah, and
who, if you mentioned school to them, it meant going to Sunday school.
Right,
Not
right.
going to be taught to read or write.
Right,
because
right.
Why did they need to know how to do something?
Right.
It was the
That's
middle
right.
class in the steampunk time frame. They were the ones that were the shopkeepers, the mechanics, the inventors, even Edison considered himself middle class.
The ones that Napoleon disparaged, seeing Britain as a nation of shopkeepers.
Yes.
Not understanding that that's exactly the kind of nation that can beat him.
So, yeah, I mean, Victoria is about the middle class. It is taking risks and doing new.
I think we all kind of draw a blank on that. But one, file found for me, it's not steampunk, but the Amelia Peabody mystery
Oh, I
series
love them.
does it crosses decades of time. I know for one, Howard Carter discovered the King Tut is an ongoing character in the series, and the protagonists are a couple of Victorian eccentrics, but over the decades their family circle expands until they've got an Egyptian young man marrying in, and
Yeah, and
So, and it
She's
comes
very
across
inclusive.
very plausibly,
Yeah.
while also being grounded in, you know, Caucasian, which is a
Yeah.
filter.
I think she does it very deftly.
She does it deftly and
Nice.
with good people all over the place, and there's wonderful villains of all
Well,
sorts.
and she's an Egyptologist, so everything she said about Budge is absolutely true. And Ness Sparrow and everybody else, you know, you can go through there and check off the names. Yeah, she knows her stuff. That's what makes it fun.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, it's something that I've been kind of struggling with for a while, is wanting to bring more people of color into my work, but really just not being, I think being so aware of just how easily I can offend.
You know, the way she does, she just writes them, you could paint them any color. She's aware, I think in being older, she's aware of the colonial aspect, and probably as Alexis as well as I am aware of what real racial divide looks like.
Mhm.
We remember the times when there were colored water fountains, and when I could not bring when my choir was taking a tour, my college choir was going to, I was in a university that was a religious university. We had students from many lands. We took a tour here in Texas around the churches. The choir director approached me and asked me if I would stay with the two black members of the choir. Now, I'd grown up Army. I didn't care what color you were. I didn't know anything about this. But this was so that they could stay in the homes of good white people. If they didn't have a white girl staying with them, they couldn't go on tour. Well, you know, this completely went over my oblivious little head until several years later when I went, oh,
I know, it's
the undercurrents of racism.
yeah,
So
it's really ridiculous.
watching To Kill a Mockingbird,
Ah,
yeah, and that scene where he tells the maid not to go home that night, and you know, years later, you understand what the whole thing was about.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think just time and experience. But
Yeah.
you have experienced people being excluded, like, that when you grew up, the geeks versus the jocks.
Oh, yeah,
So
absolutely.
you know how it's like.
I remember, that's right, I was actually talking with a friend, you know, when we talk about kind of geekdom and geek culture here, you know, conventions and stuff, he's like, yeah, I remember when geek wasn't a good thing. Not anymore. Geek's a very good thing.
But, you know, something you were
That's right.
mentioned is something I was thinking about, that little brown brother or racism or whatever it is, some of the non-European cultures at the time were also very sophisticated and interesting, even if they didn't always have the same level of material technology.
Also had some interesting racism.
Speaking of
Well,
the
absolutely.
African, speaking of the African portion of that, have any of you read the Donald Morris's book, a historical book, Washing of the Spears? It's about the rise of the Zulu nation under Shaka, and then
Oh.
he follows it up through the British Zulu Wars.
That was quite a time.
Well, yeah, I think that more, like I said, the publishers, that's what they're looking for now. They're looking for multiculturalism. They're looking for things that happen outside of Europe. And I think, and we'll be seeing more and more of that come in steampunk genre, especially because I think they're just tired. They don't want anything else that happens in London. They're tired of it. And they want to see something.
Well, it is the end of our time.
Yeah.
Would you like to say a closing word? Advertise Manapunk one more time.
Mana-pump.com, we have a lot of stuff going on the website. The RPG is getting off its grounds, and we have more books coming up.
Olivia, you too?
Yes, you can find me at omgrey, that's omgrey.wordpress.com. I blog and podcast from there. Of course, you can find my books either here from me or wherever Mr. Troll also can book formats. And every Tuesday, I do a steampunk spotlight, and I would love to showcase your thing that you're doing here. I think that sounds wonderful. That's why I wanted to do my card. So contact me about that.
Okay. And Alexis, please.
I'm working on the novel set in America in 1880. It's in the Utah, Nevada territories. So when I proofread it, which I'm doing now, then I'll be looking, hopefully to sell it and publish it. One thing I discovered in my research, apropos of what we were saying, gee, the American West had all kind of people. You go to graveyards, even Salt Lake City, boy. And, you know, some of these communities, you know, in Idaho and Utah, there's all kind of people from all around the world for all kinds of reasons. They came to the American West. And, gee, growing up, I thought it was for some reason all whites and Indians and then some Mexican people. No. The Basques, Greek Orthodox, and Jewish and Chinese and everybody. So sometimes, you know, the great, brave, cool, amazing world is the real one.
And if you want to read some strange stories, read some of the gravestones.
Yeah.
The town, my hometown, has the story of the idiots who tried to bury someone they decided to murder for his money in the snow. And I wondered why they found the body and why they were caught in the spring.
Oh.
The whole story of what happens to them is actually in the gravestone. Was actually on their gravesite in my hometown,
Which is?
Boston, New York.
Really?
Thank you, folks.
It's in the middle of town. There's in the graveyard, in the one corner, there's this huge gravestone. It tells the whole damn thing. It's like I said. So some of the grave sites in the early 20th century and the late 1880s, they'll tell the tale of what the person was.
Great stories are where you find them.
Yeah.
The German Mennonite. Somebody call security.
It's a cybernet that is out of control.
Okay. Have you seen Tanya?
No.